welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a subject that is, well, it's structural, it's psychological, and it is fundamentally crucial to understanding not just American politics, but global politics right now.
We're talking about the intense power struggle that's been unfolding across the U.S. political landscape in 2024 and 2025.
It is a huge, sprawling topic. You've got contested elections, you have a really strange judicial authority, and an executive branch that keeps expanding its power.
Right. But our mission here is really precise. We want to unpack this convergence. We're going to give you this historical architecture of the crisis, analyze the emotional fuel that's driving it,
and detail the specific, often hidden legal maneuvers that are reshaping the system as we speak. This is really your shortcut to being profoundly well-informed about what's becoming American stress test.
And we really have to begin with a paradox. Every democracy, but particularly the American one, it relies on formal rules. The Constitution, the laws, the precedents.
But at the end of the day, it doesn't survive on rules, it survives on trust.
Exactly. The rules only work if all the players and the public agree to be governed by them. And when that trust erodes, which is what we're seeing now, the rules themselves stop being guardrails.
They start becoming weapons.
They become weapons. So we're going to step way back first to ground ourselves in the history, because the roots of this current power struggle are truly embedded in the system's 18th century architecture.
Only then can you really appreciate the sophistication of the modern legal and political strategy.
And our analysis here is going to be descriptive. It's going to be explanatory. We are here to connect the dots and show you why this struggle is so profound and why, regardless of your personal politics, it matters deeply.
It matters to the future stability of the U.S. and really the entire global order. Okay, let's unpack this convergence, starting with the very foundations. We can't talk about the current instability without acknowledging that these tensions, they're not new.
Not at all. They are baked into the American system, right back to 1787.
Absolutely. The Constitution was a document born out of deep, abiding distrust.
And this distrust wasn't just aimed at, kings in Europe or some hereditary ruler.
No, the founders' fears were incredibly specific, and they profoundly dictated the structures we still live with today. The core anxiety wasn't foreign tyranny, it was domestic tyranny.
It was the tyranny of the simple majority.
Right. James Madison, who we call the father of the Constitution, he was deeply haunted by the idea of mob rule, this power of unbridled, impassioned majorities just sweeping aside minority rights or the established order.
That's the critical starting point. And they also feared the unchecked power of the executive they were creating, which is why we have checks and balances. And, crucially, they feared politicized courts.
So these fears manifested directly in the structures we all recognize, separation of powers.
Lifetime judicial appointments to try and keep the judiciary insulated from, transient political waves.
And the mechanisms for indirect election, which brings us to the famous or infamous Electoral College. We tend to frame that debate around federalism or historical compromises over slavery.
But the sources we're looking at point out a lesser-known but critical intent behind it. It was fundamentally about limiting public passion. The system was designed as a psychological filter.
Psychological filter, that's a great way to put it.
It is. The founders didn't want the most popular demagogue to immediately capture the presidency in some moment of public frenzy. They wanted electors, these wise, educated men who understood their states, to serve as a deliberate, rational break.
A way to cool down the fiery popular will.
Exactly. To ensure that the highest office was chosen not just by passion, but by reasoned judgment.
Yeah.
That inherent distrust of direct, unfiltered democracy is the original design flaw, or feature, depending on your view, that it's still generating such intense friction today.
And it sets up this recurring conflict, doesn't it? The people want one thing, but the structure is designed to prevent that very thing. So let's look at how that structure first bent under a real crisis.
Moving forward to the Civil War, we see the first major precedent for this idea that democracy could be, paused in an emergency.
You're talking about Abraham Lincoln's actions, most famously the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. That was a massive expansion of executive power.
And that suspension was not just a legal formality. It was a profound bending of the constitutional rules. It allowed the military to arrest and detain citizens without formal charges.
You're essentially putting civil liberties on hold.
You are, all in the name of preserving the Union. And this act normalized a dangerous concept for generations to come. The idea that a crisis, a civil war, an economic depression, a global conflict, it demands unilateral executive action.
Action that often bypasses Congress and even the courts.
Right. That normalization of extraordinary behavior became the precedent for every single power expansion that followed.
And then we get the most significant contested outcome in early U.S. history, the 1876 Hayes-Tilden election. This wasn't resolved by voters or by a court in the way we'd think of it today.
No, it led to this period of intense instability that was ultimately resolved by a secret political deal.
The Compromise of 1877.
Yes. This was the moment where power brokers literally traded the presidency, giving it to Rutherford B. Hayes, in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South.
A deal made entirely behind closed doors.
And in doing so, they sacrificed the entire project of racial equality and full integration. It effectively ended Reconstruction.
All for the sake of stabilizing the federal government and settling the election.
And that established an incredibly cynical, dangerous precedent. That electoral outcomes can be negotiated by elite power brokers, and that fundamental rights can just be abandoned for political expediency.
It planted these deep seeds of distrust that festered for decades.
And that crisis also introduced us to a specific legal frontier that remains largely dormant, but is incredibly relevant today.
What's that?
It's the Guarantee Clause. It's in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. And it states that the federal government must guarantee every state a Republican form of government.
That sounds pretty abstract. What is the latent power there? I mean, I've never heard of it being invoked.
Because historically, courts have been highly reluctant to touch it. They classify it as a political question that's best left to Congress. But in today's environment,
with state legislatures asserting so much power over elections.
Exactly. Where contested outcomes could potentially involve one state faction claiming the government has become illegitimate, that clause holds immense latent power.
So if a state's electoral process completely breaks down, or if you have competing slates of electors claiming they're the legitimate ones,
Congress or the executive could potentially invoke the Guarantee Clause to justify federal intervention, arguing that the state is no longer functioning as a Republican form of government.
So it's basically the ultimate constitutional emergency override. It's a sleeping giant that could be weaponized in a real constitutional void.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Which brings us to the next century and the rise of the centralized state.
Right. The 20th century then saw the rise of what's often called the imperial presidency.
And this really starts with FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. Faced with the Great Depression, the executive branch just massively expanded its authority, creating hundreds of new agencies and commissions.
This is the birth of the administrative state.
The very same vast bureaucratic structure that modern unitary executive theorists now explicitly aim to dismantle.
And this expansion was then cemented by decades of global conflict. The Cold War especially seemed to require a president who could act fast, unilaterally, and secretly.
That's right. I mean, global conflict was used to justify secrecy, surveillance, and unilateral action, both at home and abroad. This cultural and structural shift meant that citizens, regardless of their party, they grew accustomed to the idea of a strong president who could solve problems decisively.
It dramatically elevated the executive as the natural center of power, often sidelining a Congress that was and is frequently gridlocked.
So after this huge expansion of executive power was exposed during Watergate, Congress finally tried to rein it in.
They passed crucial legislation, the War Powers Act, the Ethics in Government Act. They established independent councils, greater congressional oversight.
But what we're living through right now, as the source material notes, is the systematic dismantling of these very post-Watergate guardrails.
We're seeing a structural pushback against them.
A very systematic one. For decades, presidents of both parties chafed under these constraints. But the current effort is highly organized. I mean, think about the weakening of the Inspector General system, the increased use of executive privilege.
The defunding of oversight bodies.
Exactly. The post-Watergate consensus that the presidency needed to be leashed has just evaporated. It's been replaced by this belief, particularly among unitary executive theorists, that these checks are illegitimate obstacles to effective governance.
And this dismantling coincides with the judiciary pivoting into a role the founders never intended for it, and one it hadn't really embraced before the year 2000.
Right. The pivotal moment here, the thing that really cemented the courts as political players, is Bush v. Gore.
It was a watershed moment. the Supreme Court intervened to halt a statewide recount, basing its decision on equal protection grounds.
And in doing so, it essentially made itself the final arbiter of a presidential election. This politicized the court in the public mind like never before.
And regardless of the legal justifications, the public perception was that 5 political actors in robes had chosen the president.
That perception, which persists today, is that judicial rulings are political victories or betrayals. It completely erodes the image of the court as a neutral referee.
And this politicization leads directly into the decentralization of rules, which really set the stage for our current election conflicts. After Bush v. Gore, a lot of people realized that the real action was happening at the state level.
In how voting laws were written and how elections were administered.
Precisely. Starting around 2010, we saw this massive wave of state-level voting law changes, all driven by partisan interests.
And that whole process was accelerated and amplified by the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, which gutted the key preclearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act.
Explain that connection for us. How did gutting that federal oversight lead to the current conflict?
Well, the preclearance requirement meant that jurisdictions with a history of discrimination had to clear any voting changes with the federal government, either the Department of Justice or a D.C. court, before they could implement them.
Okay, so it was a federal backstop.
A critical one. When that requirement was removed, it unleashed hundreds of disparate state laws about everything. Voter ID, registration purges, where polling places are located, absentee voting.
This immediately diversified and decentralized the rules of our elections.
And voting procedures stopped being just these technical systems that were administered uniformly. They became cultural symbols and points of intense partisan conflict. When the rules of the game are constantly changing and they vary wildly from one county to the next, it creates this fertile, nationalized ground for confusion, for litigation, and most importantly, for mistrust.
So if the long arc of history gave us this shaky architecture fear of the majority, normalization of executive emergency power, a politicized judiciary, and decentralized rules, that brings us to today. That architecture is now being supercharged by modern emotional and social forces.
And that's where we have to go next. We have to move from institutional history to the human drivers that are amplifying these tensions in 2024-2025.
What's truly critical to grasp here is that the crisis is fundamentally psychological.
It's not just about policy or law. It's about identity and feeling and perception. The intensity of the institutional struggle is really just a mirror image of the intensity of our internal social conflict.
The sources we looked at highlight several key psychological concepts at play, starting with something called identity fusion.
Identity fusion. In modern American politics, our political affiliation has become so thoroughly intertwined with our personal, moral, and social identity that political disagreements, they feel less like policy debates.
And more like existential threats to our entire way of life.
This fusion dramatically shifts the stakes. I mean, when a policy difference, say over environmental regulation or immigration, is perceived as a threat to your very identity group, it moves from the negotiation table to a battle for survival.
And this is why we see the prevalence of what's called motivated reasoning and moral absolutism.
Right. People stop evaluating facts rationally, and they start defending their core beliefs emotionally. They see their opponents not as rivals who just happen to disagree, but as existential threats to the national project or their family's security.
And this psychological reality is what creates the dreaded epistemic crisis. It's the shift from a polarization of values where we disagree on goals, but we agree on the facts,
to a profound polarization of facts, where we can't even agree on what happened yesterday.
That's the breakdown of shared reality.
It is. Social identity theory shows that party affiliation has become a mega identity, and it often overrides objective data and shared information. If one side believes a free and fair election happened and the other believes it was stolen, they're literally inhabiting different realities.
So for many people, especially those experiencing this identity fusion, accepting an electoral loss feels like a direct existential threat to their group's survival.
Which makes narratives of electoral fraud or institutional corruption psychologically necessary. It's a way to protect the mega identity rather than acknowledge defeat.
And the data really supports how severe this feeling is. The sources noted that psychological studies in 2025 showed 80% of Americans believe the country is greatly divided on core values.
That is a staggering number, and it reflects a profound sense of fundamental incompatibility. Even if that perception is a little exaggerated, The belief that you and your opponents share no core moral ground is what makes compromise impossible.
And it justifies the win-at-all-costs mentality.
Of course, if your opponent is an existential threat, then any action necessary to defeat them, even bending or breaking institutional norms, is seen as justified.
So when everything feels like an existential battle, the conflict itself changes its nature. Sociologists describe the culture wars metastasizing into what we can call politics as total war.
A zero-sum conflict over who controls the national identity, the history, the future.
The shift is from we disagree on the tax rate to
if they win, the country we know and love ceases to exist. And this totalizing view immediately generates that win-at-all-costs mentality, where institutional norms aren't constraints, they're just strategic obstacles to be dismantled or weaponized.
You see this playing out in concrete terms. Public health measures, school curricula, even military budgeting, they aren't treated as policy choices.
They're viewed as moral markers of absolute loyalty or existential betrayal.
And the constant high-stakes nature of this conflict creates immense strain, which leads to what the sources call democratic fatigue.
The repeated crises, government shutdowns, constant court battles, the daily threat of political collapse, they create this collective anxiety, a sense of learned helplessness and deep cynicism toward institutions.
People get tired of the instability.
They do. And when citizens feel helpless and cynical, they often become deeply attracted to strong leaders who promise to cut through the mess, who promise decisive action, and who promise to restore order, even at the cost of democratic norms.
That learned helplessness and anxiety is so pervasive that the sources detailed a fascinating clinical finding. Mental health professionals actually identified political anxiety as a distinct clinical stressor.
Which is a significant finding. It's not just general stress. It's a specific pathology linked to the political climate. The climate of precariousness, the constant threat of mass layoffs, the precarity of court rulings, this feeling that fundamental rights could shift depending on which judge you stand before.
It ripples through the economy, through family dynamics.
And this anxiety creates a kind of cultural exhaustion that undermines the very resilience you need to defend democratic institutions.
This psychological landscape then feeds the breakdown in trust. We have these fragmented realities shaped by different media ecosystems.
When the public sphere splits into multiple information universes, you lose the necessary foundation for shared governance, which is a shared set of verifiable facts.
And the rapid change in the rules of the game just makes this worse. When the judiciary, which is supposed to be the stable referee, shifts its role from precedent setter to policy enabler, it causes profound social anomie.
A sense of normlessness. The sources point out that when core institutional players, like the courts, change their functions so rapidly and become perceived as active participants in executive expansion, the public loses its reference points. It signals that power, not procedure, is the ultimate decider.
Wait a second, if the judiciary is intervening so much, halting recounts, issuing these massive rulings, isn't that centralizing power? How does that lead to decentralized rules and normlessness?
That's the central paradox. The Supreme Court's power is centralized. They decide the law, but their decisions enable the decentralization of norms and rules.
Okay, break that down.
By validating aggressive state election law changes, like in Shelby County, or allowing policy to stand in a fragmented legal landscape, which we'll discuss next, the High Court is essentially telling political actors, you are free to try your hardest at the state or executive level. We will provide the legal cover.
So it creates a fragmented, constantly shifting legal reality where trust is impossible.
And the irony is that the crisis itself, the attacks on courts, the press, the electoral system, it becomes routine rhetoric. This creates what researchers call alarm fatigue, and it lowers the public's guardrails.
So this psychological stress test is the high-octane fuel driving the political drama of 2024 and 2025. We have the shaky historical architecture and the emotional fuel. Now we move into the core of this deep dive, how that all converged in the contemporary period.
Right, specifically focusing on the legal and political maneuvers we've seen over the last couple of years, we have to start by defining the unitary executive theory, as it's the philosophical engine of the current executive push.
This isn't just an academic idea, is it? It's a practical blueprint for governance.
Absolutely. It asserts that all executive power resides solely and completely in the president, granting total unilateral control over every single agency and official within the executive branch.
So who are the proponents and what's the constitutional argument behind this, well, maximalist view?
Key proponents are conservative legal scholars like John Yoo. They argue that the vesting clause of Article 2 of the Constitution grants this total power. Their philosophical argument is really twofold.
Okay.
First, that a strong executive is necessary in modern complex societies to act efficiently in a world of complex foreign threats and domestic crises. And second, they argue that total presidential control is necessary for accountability.
Accountability? How so?
The argument is that if the president can be held accountable for every action of every agency, they must have the power to direct or remove those agency heads instantly.
And what does this theory enable in practice?
It enables the current administration's explicit goal to systematically dismantle what they call the administrative state, that vast network of rules and career professionals that govern environmental protections, health standards, labor practices, you name it.
They view the administrative state, often called the deep state, as an unaccountable fourth branch of government.
Exactly. One that thwarts the democratic will expressed by the election of the president. So current actions are framed not as institutional erosion, but as a restoration of proper constitutional order.
And that theory was given staggering practical force in July of 2024 with the Supreme Court's ruling in Trump v. United States. That decision granted presumptive immunity for official presidential acts.
This was a seismic shift. I mean, historically, presidents enjoyed qualified immunity, but this decision fundamentally altered the risk-reward calculus for executive orders by granting this presumptive immunity.
Which means the burden of proof shifts to the prosecutor to show the act was purely private or criminal rather than the defense showing it was official.
Right. It gave the president unprecedented legal confidence to act aggressively in pursuit of policy goals without fear of immediate legal consequence or prosecution after leaving office. It dramatically raises the bar for holding a president legally accountable.
And we saw the results of that altered calculus immediately in January 2025 with a flurry of executive orders. We're witnessing governance by decree at an accelerated pace.
Absolutely. The strategy involves maximizing presidential speed and authority, often by using archaic or obscure laws to bypass modern legislative gridlock. A stark example is the use of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to facilitate deportations.
The Alien Enemies Act, that's over 225 years old. Why that specific law?
Because it was enacted long before modern due process protections and immigration law even existed. It grants the president unilateral authority in times of declared war or hostility to apprehend, restrain, secure, and remove non-citizens defined as alien enemies.
So by invoking this law, which bypassed the need for new, difficult-to-pass immigration legislation,
the administration demonstrated its commitment to using any legal technicality available, however ancient, to centralize and maximize executive speed.
This commitment to centralized power and dismantling the bureaucracy also manifested in the high-stakes conflict over the federal workforce, the Schedule F dispute.
This is one of the most critical yet least understood pieces of this entire deep dive. Schedule F is a classification created through executive order that reclassifies tens of thousands of federal workers
Who previously held protected civil service status
as at-will employees.
Right.
And these are not low-level clerks. These are often high-level policy analysts, government lawyers, compliance officers. The staff whose institutional knowledge acts as a brake on rapid, politically driven policy changes.
And the immediate specific consequences were immense. The sources detailed a mass layoff of 16,000 federal workers in early 2025.
Right alongside a 41-day government shutdown over funding for mass deportation infrastructure. This was a deliberate assertion of unilateral power over the executive's own bureaucracy.
And the layoffs didn't just send shockwaves through the federal workforce, creating a climate of fear and self-censorship.
No, they also severely hampered the operational capacity of crucial agencies, slowing safety inspections, delaying budget processing, and destroying decades of institutional knowledge. This contributed directly to that climate of economic and institutional precariousness we talked about earlier.
It signals that expertise and tenure are secondary to political loyalty.
Which brings us to the courts, which are functioning as active, albeit controversial, partners in this power shift. With lifetime appointments, the Supreme Court is increasingly viewed through a purely ideological lens.
Every ruling is interpreted as a political victory or a betrayal, regardless of the judicial reasoning offered.
And the next monumental shift happened in June 2025 with the Supreme Court ruling in Trump v. Casa. This ruling addressed a long-standing administrative procedure issue, but its effect was to essentially end the ability of lower courts to issue nationwide injunctions.
This is a fundamental change to how federal law is enforced, isn't it?
It's a huge change. Previously, If a single federal judge in Hawaii found a major federal policy like an environmental reg or an immigration policy unconstitutional, that judge could issue an injunction that froze the policy across all 50 states.
And Trump's Isaiah dismantled that tool. So what does that mean for executive power now?
The change is dramatic. Now, even if one judge finds an executive order unconstitutional in their district, say Southern California, that order can remain fully in effect everywhere else in the country. Texas, Florida, Maine, you name it.
This allows executive policy to persist in a fragmented legal landscape, giving the executive branch a massive advantage in speed and enforcement.
And by the time the ruling makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, the policy has often already been implemented for months or even years.
And much of this fundamental power shift is happening outside the standard, fully briefed, publicly argued cases.
No.
We need to talk about the increasing reliance on the shadow docket.
The shadow docket is the Supreme Court's emergency docket, used for urgent applications, often requests for stays or expedited procedural changes.
The controversy comes because significant rulings, which can change policy instantly and have massive national implications, are issued without full briefing, without oral argument.
And often without signed dissents, making them highly opaque. This lack of transparency is problematic because it accelerates the sense of the judiciary acting purely as a political actor.
So by using the shadow docket, the court can push through controversial decisions quickly, often reversing lower court decisions with minimal stated reasoning.
Which speeds up the executive's ability to implement policy and frustrates any attempt by opponents to use the regular, slower legal process to challenge those policies. It's an administrative tool that has been weaponized into a political accelerator.
Let's ground this in reality. We can use the 2025 birthright order case to illustrate this new, fragmented rights reality created by the Trump v. Say-So ruling.
Right, so the executive attempted to fundamentally change the interpretation of the 14th Amendment regarding birthright citizenship. The order focused on a narrow, technical reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment's clause, stating that citizenship is granted to all persons subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
And the argument was that this clause should exclude children born to undocumented immigrants, claiming they aren't fully subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government.
And when the order was challenged, because of the Trump v. Say-So ruling, the challenge resulted in this profoundly fragmented legal outcome. The order was only paused in specific sympathetic districts, like those covering California and New York.
But it remained fully in effect in districts in other states, like Texas or Florida, where judges either didn't rule or ruled against the challengers.
And the immediate consequence was that children born in late 2025 in those states were immediately placed in legal limbo for months.
Hospitals didn't know how to fill out birth certificates. Families didn't know if their newborn children legally existed as citizens.
Their constitutional rights depended entirely on their ZIP code and which federal district they happened to be born in. This administrative and human chaos is a direct result of ending nationwide injunctions and maximizing executive speed. The system is designed to create confusion and instability that favors the party already holding power.
And finally, we have the third pillar of this convergence, the permanent state of contested elections. This creates what the sources call the legitimacy double bind.
Both major factions now deeply question the system's legitimacy. One is fueled by unfounded fraud claims and state interventions, the other by concerns over voter suppression and partisan court rulings. This mutual self-reinforcing distrust makes any electoral outcome potentially combustible.
And election integrity has now morphed into a permanent industry. What does that look like on the ground?
It's the institutionalization of mistrust. It means specialized organizations, dedicated funding, and state laws enabling the creation of election crime units.
And these units, often under state attorneys general, are empowered to investigate, monitor, and prosecute election-related offenses.
The sociological impact is profound. It fundamentally changes the act of voting from a protected civic duty into a potential legal risk. It chills participation and reinforces that politics is total war mentality. Every ballot becomes suspect.
And to understand how successful this delegitimization campaign has been, we have to look at the Arizona Cyber Ninjas audit from 2021. This was a perfect microcosm of the modern crisis playbook.
It was an expensive, high-profile farce that was, at the same time, strategically brilliant. The audit was hired by the GOP-led state Senate completely bypassing professional election officials in Maricopa County.
It was run by a firm with no electoral experience, operating under the explicit premise that fraud had occurred.
They searched for phantom irregularities like bamboo fibers on ballots, a bizarre, specific detail that perfectly illustrates the lengths they went to in search of a predetermined outcome.
And the factual result, despite all the cost and effort?
The audit ultimately confirmed Joe Biden's original victory. But, as you noted, the success was never in the factual outcome. The process successfully achieved its true purpose, delegitimizing the official professional count in the eyes of millions of voters.
And showcasing the power of a partisan state legislature to intervene after an election, creating a playbook for fueling distrust regardless of what the facts actually show.
And that playbook means that the system's safeguards are constantly being tested. Which brings us to the new rules put in place after 2020. Congress passed the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 to clarify its procedures for counting presidential votes.
It was a crucial step that tried to close the loophole that allowed some members of Congress to challenge results based on specious claims.
The ECRA clarifies the limited role of the vice president and raises the threshold for congressional challenges. However, a core ambiguity remains. The real crisis scenario involves a state submitting competing slates of electors.
What happens then?
The ECRA provides procedures, but they are novel and untested. The scenario involves two different bodies in a state, say, the governor and the state legislature, each certifying a different slate of electors for different presidential candidates. This would immediately trigger a high-pressure procedural battle in Congress, forcing actors to choose partisan advantage over fidelity to the law, all while the country watches.
It relies entirely on the character of the actors involved.
And it demonstrates that our 18th century structure is fundamentally vulnerable to ill intent.
So we have the historical vulnerabilities, the psychological urgency, and the legal battleground of 2024-2025. Now we need to step back and critically analyze this environment, separating the rhetoric and the hype from the cold reality.
Right. Let's start by contextualizing the widespread panic. Myth number one, this is the worst crisis ever.
And the truth, informed by the sources, is that the U.S. has faced comparable and potentially more immediately violent and destabilizing moments. 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, with global totalitarianism on the rise, and 1968, a year defined by assassinations, riots, and institutional collapse.
The difference today is not the intensity of the issues, but the speed, the visibility, and the media amplification. The fact that every crisis is instantly globalized, polarized, and consumed in a fragmented media environment.
The 18th century structure is operating at a 21st century velocity, which makes every event feel instantaneous and existential.
Okay, and the second myth is one fueled by dramatic rhetoric, especially concerning the expansion of executive power, the dictator for a day, this idea that the system will just suddenly be suspended by unilateral fiat.
And the reality in 2025 is far more sophisticated and I would say insidious. It's a legalistic revolution.
Right. The administration isn't breaking the law so much as it's using a sympathetic, politically aligned judiciary to redefine what the law allows. It's a strategy of constitutional hardball, stretching the law's fabric to its breaking point through procedural changes, archaic law invocation, and strategic use of the shadow docket.
It's not about outright ignoring the Constitution.
No, and that strategy is harder to oppose because it operates within the veneer of legality.
Which brings us to a crucial, lesser-known truth. We have an 18th century architecture under 21st century stress.
The key structural problem is anachronism. The Constitution never anticipated the modern phenomena we live with. Social media creating permanent mass communication, the fragmentation of shared information, or global ideological influence operating in real time. We are asking a governing structure designed for a small agrarian republic where communication took weeks to manage a hyper-complex, digitized, globalized world that operates in milliseconds.
The political system is under extreme functional stress because of this profound structural mismatch.
Given this complexity, experts are sharply divided on the severity and direction of the crisis. It's useful for our listener to break down the major theories into a few different camps.
Okay, first, you have the institutionalists, famously represented by people like Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt.
The institutionalists argue that democracies erode gradually, and the bedrock of stability is norms, these unwritten rules of mutual toleration and institutional restraint, not just the written laws. They warn that when political parties prioritize victory over the constitutional order, the system is in peril.
Their primary concern is the risk of illiberal democracy,
where elections are held, but the fundamental norms that ensure minority rights, a free press, and peaceful transitions are systematically dismantled.
Then you have the populists and unitary theorists, exemplified by scholars like John Yoo, whose theories we discussed earlier, and how do they respond to that?
Their view is a direct challenge to the institutionalists. They argue that strong, total executive power is necessary in complex societies to cut through bureaucratic gridlock. They fundamentally see the current actions dismantling the administrative state, the maximal use of executive power, not as erosion, but as a long overdue restoration of democratic will.
Against what they perceive as an unaccountable, unelected bureaucracy. For them, stability comes from clear, centralized authority, not from soft norms.
A third camp consists of the backsliding experts, like Yasha Monk and analysts from Freedom House.
And they apply specific political science models of internal conflict and democratic backsliding models traditionally used to study places like Venezuela or Hungary to the U.S. context.
They do. And they point to the rising level of effective polarization, viewing the other side as an enemy, and the use of an authoritarian legal playbook.
Specifically capturing courts, purging the civil service, and delegitimizing elections.
As concrete, measurable indicators of pre-insurrectionary risk, they see the U.S. following a familiar, dangerous script.
And finally, you have the systemic analysts, like historian Heather Cox Richardson.
They frame the struggle as a historical cycle, pitting two distinct visions against each other: a multiracial, pluralistic vision of democracy versus a hierarchical, authoritarian one. For them, the current confrontation is just the climax of a battle as old as the Republic itself, just intensified by modern technology and identity politics.
What stands out to me is how the struggle is simultaneously about these fundamental, centuries-old philosophies and these immediate, highly technical legal maneuvers. It's hard to keep track of the sheer velocity of the conflict.
And it's crucial to remember that the world is watching this stress test in real time. The U.S. crisis is not isolated. Its instability ripples across global alliances and empowers adversaries.
We have to view it through a global mirror. So what are our allies thinking? Places like Europe, Japan, Canada.
For them, the crisis is viewed with deep concern for global stability. A U.S. that is consumed by internal conflict and constantly questioning its own constitutional order simply cannot effectively lead the democratic alliance.
It creates a dangerous vacuum.
A huge one, especially on issues like NATO cohesion, trade security, and climate negotiations.
And meanwhile, our adversaries like Russia and China must be loving this.
They are actively leveraging the chaos. They frame the struggle as irrefutable evidence of Western democratic hypocrisy and decay. They use the narrative of U.S. dysfunction, the contested elections, the mass layoffs, the fragmented rights, to bolster the legitimacy of their own centralized authoritarian models.
Arguing that stability and efficiency are only achievable through total governmental control.
And perhaps most critically, what about emerging democracies?
They see the U.S. not as an aspirational model, but as a cautionary tale. If the oldest modern democracy can falter so quickly and slide toward illiberalism, their own paths are deemed even more precarious.
The U.S. is increasingly viewed internationally not as the city on a hill, but as an example of how quickly an established democracy can transition into a competitive authoritarian system.
One that maintains the facade of elections but lacks the norms and institutional checks required for true liberalism.
Before concluding that the American experiment is over, though, we have to look at the structural strengths that have kept the system from collapsing entirely, despite this massive stress.
Okay, so what are they?
Well, there are major structural strengths that shouldn't be overlooked. First, the U.S. constitutional structure possesses remarkable flexibility. It allows for reform, even under duress, as we saw with the Electoral Count Reform Act.
And the judiciary, though polarized, is still functional. It still operates under distinct professional norms.
This was powerfully demonstrated right after 2020, where over 60 post-election lawsuits were rejected for a simple lack of evidence, often by federal judges appointed by the very party bringing the suits. Institutional professionalism won out over partisan pressure in that specific test.
And the crisis itself has had a positive side effect. It has activated civil society and legal communities in defense of procedural integrity.
It's forced a long overdue national conversation about the mechanics and vulnerabilities of our 18th century system. However, the weaknesses are existential, and they are being actively exploited.
The system suffers from an over-reliance on norms rather than enforcement.
When actors decide to violate established norms for political gain, like respecting the independence of the civil service or conceding an election, the entire system relies on other actors voluntarily restraining themselves.
Which is a rare commodity in a zero-sum environment.
And what was once viewed as the genius of the system decentralization is now a critical weakness in a crisis of legitimacy.
Because it creates multiple points of failure.
Precisely. A single state legislature, a rogue official, a pressured court in one jurisdiction, any of these can create a national crisis. In a high-stakes crisis of legitimacy, this fragmentation prevents a unified, credible, national response that the whole country can rally behind.
And the primary danger, the one that ties together executive expansion, court politicization, and election contestation, is the loss of the neutral arbiter.
When courts are successfully framed and perceived as extensions of the presidency, disputes are no longer resolved through accepted law and precedent, but through raw political power. This guarantees civil unrest and economic instability. The ultimate risk is a constitutional void,
where civic trust has entirely evaporated and two major factions claim legitimate authority simultaneously, with no institutional mechanism left that the entire nation accepts as the final decider. This has been a necessary and deeply analytical look at the American stress test.
To summarize the key takeaways, the struggle is psychological, it's structural, and it is profoundly legal. It's driven by the convergence of executive overreach, judicial politicization, and permanent election contestation.
All supercharged by identity politics and fragmentation. We have left the era of agreed-upon rules and entered the era of constitutional hardball.
And we must remember, the struggle is not merely about who wins the next election or passes the next law. It is a fundamental test of emotional and institutional maturity. The structural problems mean the question is no longer who won, but the deeper unresolved question that permeates the entire system.
Who decides who won?
And more importantly, will the losing faction accept that decider's authority, or will they deem the decider illegitimate?
The future direction hinges entirely on whether the U.S. will see a reinstitutionalization where political parties and leaders recommit to the rules above immediate power, or a continued weaponization of ambiguity, where every lever of government from an 18th century statute to the shadow docket is used for permanent, total contestation.
The survival of the American experiment depends on whether democracy remains a shared belief, upheld by mutual restraint, rather than just a brittle legal system. And here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward. The challenge isn't simply the presence of extreme conflict. Conflict is inherent to any free society. The real challenge is finding a path to agree on the process of conflict resolution, the referee, the field, and the rules, even when the stakes feel completely existential. The answer to that question will define not just America, but the very idea of democracy in the modern digital world. This is the ultimate test.